Nobody in the room was supposed to move. That was the rule. That had always been the rule. When the royal family gathered inside the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle for a private lunch following a memorial service, every person present, staff, guards, and guests alike, understood their role. They were to stand quietly, speak only when spoken to, and disappear into the background like furniture. But on that cold afternoon in late autumn, a royal guard broke that rule. He stepped forward. He raised one hand, and the entire room fell into a silence so thick and so sharp that even the fire in the stone hearth seemed to stop crackling for a moment. It had started, as most terrible things do, with something very small. Princess Charlotte had been seated near the long oak dining table, picking at a plate of food she had no real appetite for. She was 9 years old, composed and polished in the way that royal children are taught to be from the moment they can walk. She wore a dark navy dress, her hair pinned neatly at the back. She sat with the kind of straight posture that came not from comfort, but from years of quiet instruction. Around her, adults spoke in low voices about the memorial service that had just ended, about flowers and arrangements, about schedules for the evening. Charlotte listened to all of it without appearing to listen at all. She had a gift for that, for sitting inside a room and absorbing everything while giving nothing away. Tom Parker Bowles arrived late. He came through the side door that connected the smaller sitting room to the dining hall, and the energy in the room shifted immediately when he entered. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the easy confidence of someone who had spent decades moving through powerful spaces without ever having to earn entry into them. He was Camilla's son, the king's stepson, and that relationship gave him a certain freedom that few other guests could claim. He laughed loudly when he greeted two older relatives near the door. He accepted a glass of wine before he had even fully removed his coat. He moved through the space like a man who believed the room existed for his enjoyment. For the first hour, everything was fine. Tom was charming in the way he could be when the occasion called for it. He made jokes that landed well with the older guests. He spoke warmly about the memorial and said kind things about the person being remembered. The household staff refilled glasses, the kitchen brought out plates of food, and the afternoon stretched on in the quiet and organized way that royal gatherings were supposed to. Charlotte finished her food early and moved to the far end of the room near the fireplace, where a small writing desk had been set up with paper and colored pencils, a quiet concession to the fact that children found these long afternoons difficult. She began to draw. Nobody paid her much attention. She was a child doing what children did at adult gatherings. She was invisible in the way children are when grown-ups have more interesting things to discuss. But Tom noticed her. It would be unfair to say his intentions were bad. Those who later described what happened were careful to say that he walked over to Charlotte with what appeared to be genuine friendliness, the kind of loose, warm attention that a person offers a child when they are slightly bored and slightly wine-warmed and looking for a lighter conversation. He crouched down beside the desk and looked at what she was drawing. He made a comment. Charlotte responded politely. He made another comment. This one, though, was different. It was the kind of comment that an adult sometimes makes without thinking, something careless and slightly cutting. Dressed up as a joke, Charlotte's pencil stopped moving. She looked at him, not with tears, not with visible hurt, but with a long, steady look that was far older than her 9 years. She said something back to him, quiet enough that only he could hear it, and whatever she said, it landed badly. Tom's expression changed. The easy smile shifted into something tighter. He said something else. Charlotte responded again, and then, with a speed that surprised everyone who saw it, Tom reached across the desk and took the drawing from under her hand. It was not a violent movement. It was not aggressive in any physical sense, but it was wrong. Everyone in the room who was watching, and by now several people were watching, understood immediately that it was wrong. You did not take things from Princess Charlotte. You did not reach across her space, touch her belongings, or treat her like an ordinary child who could be teased and handled carelessly. She was the daughter of the Prince and Princess of Wales. She was in every room she entered. Royalty and the royal guard by the door understood this better than anyone. He was a young man, Barely 30, and he had been standing in the same position for nearly 2 hours without moving a single muscle. His job was to be invisible. His job was to observe and to respond only in moments of genuine threat. A grown man taking a child's drawing was not, by any textbook definition, a security threat. But something in the room had cracked open. Something in Charlotte's expression, still so controlled, still so deliberately calm, communicated distress in a way that needed no words. The guard stepped forward, and the room held its breath. The guard's name was James Whitmore. He had served the royal household for 7 years. He had stood outside doors during state dinners, walked corridors at 3 in the morning during security sweeps, and stood motionless for 4 hours at a stretch during public ceremonies without complaint. He had been trained to manage crowd threats, physical intrusions, and hostile encounters. He had never in 7 years been trained for this, for the specific, suffocating awkwardness of stepping between a member of the extended royal family and a royal child during a private lunch at Windsor Castle, but he stepped forward anyway. He did not raise his voice. He did not touch Tom Parker Bowles. He simply moved from his position near the door, crossed the room in 6 measured steps, and came to stand slightly to the left of Charlotte's chair, close enough to make his presence felt, far enough to avoid direct confrontation. His hands remained at his sides. His face was completely neutral. He said nothing. He simply stood there, and the meaning of his standing there was absolutely clear to every adult in the room. Tom felt it immediately. He looked up from the drawing he was still holding, and found James Whitmore standing close enough that he would have had to turn his shoulder to leave. Tom's expression shifted through several emotions very quickly: surprise, irritation, and then a careful blankness that men like him put on when they feel embarrassed and do not want to show it. He looked at the drawing in his hand, as though he was seeing it for the first time, as though he had forgotten he was holding it. Then, with a short and slightly strained laugh, he set it back down on the desk in front of Charlotte. "Just having a look," he said. His voice was relaxed, but the relaxation was performed. "Your Highness draws very well." Charlotte did not respond. She picked up her pencil and began drawing again, as if Tom Parker Bowles had simply ceased to exist. It was a masterpiece of controlled dismissal, delivered by a 9-year-old with the precision of someone who had spent her entire life. Inside rooms where power was communicated through silence, Tom straightened up, adjusted his jacket, and walked back toward the other side of the room where a group of relatives were deep in conversation about something else entirely. James Whitmore returned to his position by the door. He resumed his stillness. His face returned to its blank, professional calm. To anyone who had not been watching closely, nothing had happened at all. But several people had been watching closely. Among them was a senior member of the household staff, a woman named Margaret Howell, who had worked at Windsor for over 20 years and who had a memory for these things that was both a gift and a burden. She saw everything and said nothing in the moment. But she would later describe the incident with careful precision to colleagues who had not been in the room. She said that the guard's intervention had been the right call. She also said that what had preceded it, Tom's behavior at the desk, the comment he had made before taking the drawing, the way he had reached across Charlotte's space had been inappropriate in a way that went beyond ordinary thoughtlessness. What had Tom actually said to Charlotte before taking the drawing? This was the question that nobody could fully answer in the weeks that followed, because nobody had been close enough to hear the first exchange. What witnesses agreed on was the sequence of events. Tom had approached Charlotte in a friendly manner. A comment had been made that caused Charlotte's pencil to stop. Charlotte had responded. Tom had said something further, and Charlotte had said something back that visibly unsettled him. The taking of the drawing had come immediately after that, a gesture that read, to those watching, less like playfulness and more like an attempt to reassert some control over a situation that had slipped from his hands. What Charlotte had said to him, the line that had changed his expression, that had moved him from easy charm into something tighter and more defensive, remained private. Charlotte never repeated it to anyone as far as anyone knew, and Tom certainly did not repeat it. But the people who were in that room and who watched his face in the seconds after she spoke described it in the same way. Independently of each other, they said he looked like a man who had been very gently and very completely put in his place. By someone he had badly underestimated, the afternoon continued. Plates were cleared. Guests moved between rooms. The fire in the hearth burned lower. Outside, the November sky had gone the color of wet stone, and the gardens below the castle windows were bare and brown. Tom Parker Bowles spent the remaining hour of the gathering on the far side of the room. He did not approach the writing desk again. He did not look toward Charlotte again, or if he did, he was careful not to be caught doing it. Charlotte drew for another 30 minutes, then packed the pencils neatly back into their tin and pushed back her chair with quiet precision. A member of her personal staff appeared at her elbow. They always appeared, these people, materializing at the exact right moment as if summoned by thought. Alone, and Charlotte left the room without looking back. James Whitmore watched her go. He allowed himself one small exhale. Then he turned his eyes forward again and stood perfectly still. Because his shift had 2 more hours left in it, and there was still work to be done. But the story did not end when Charlotte left the room. It had, in fact, barely begun. By the following morning, 4 separate members of the Windsor household staff knew what had happened. By the afternoon, that number had doubled. This was not because anyone was gossiping in the ordinary sense of the word. Royal household staff understood very well the professional and personal consequences of loose conversation. But Windsor Castle was a place where walls had ears in the most literal sense, and information moved through its corridors with a quiet efficiency that would have impressed any intelligence organization. The version that circulated among the staff was careful and stripped of exaggeration. It described a moment of poor judgment on Tom Parker Bowles' part, a dignified response from Princess Charlotte, and a measured intervention from a royal guard that had prevented the situation from escalating further. Nobody used dramatic language. Nobody suggested that anything violent had occurred or that Charlotte had been in danger in any physical sense. But the consensus among those who had seen it or heard about it was consistent. Tom had behaved badly. Charlotte had handled it with extraordinary composure, and James Whitmore had done exactly what needed to be done. What made the incident more complicated was the question of what to do about it. In most workplaces, the answer would be simple. A man had behaved inappropriately toward a child. A colleague had intervened, and the matter would be reported, reviewed, and addressed through formal channels. But this was not most workplaces. Tom Parker Bowles was the son of Queen Camilla, the king's stepson, a member of the extended family whose relationship to the crown was informal, but whose access to royal spaces and gatherings was effectively unlimited. Reporting his behavior through formal channels meant, in practical terms, reporting it to people who worked for the king, which meant reporting it to people who worked indirectly. For a family that included Tom himself, this was the calculation that Margaret Howell turned over in her mind for the entire evening after the lunch. She was not a timid woman. She had served through enough royal drama over 20 years to understand that silence was sometimes the most dangerous option available. But she was also not reckless. She understood the difference between acting with integrity and acting in a way that caused chaos without achieving anything useful. She made her decision the following morning. She requested a private meeting with the household's senior protection officer, a man named David Carroll, who had overseen security arrangements at Windsor for 12 years and who was known for handling sensitive matters with the kind of discretion that made him extraordinarily valuable and nearly invisible at the same time. She sat across from him in his small office near the East Wing and told him, in precise and measured terms, what she had witnessed. She described the sequence of events. She described Tom's behavior and Charlotte's response. She described James Whitmore's intervention. Carroll listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked her 2 questions. The first was whether Charlotte had appeared physically unharmed. The second was whether anyone outside the household staff and the invited guests was aware of what had occurred. Margaret answered both questions honestly. Charlotte had appeared physically unharmed, and as far as she knew, the incident had remained entirely inside the walls of Windsor. Carroll nodded slowly. He told her that he would need to speak with James Whitmore directly, and that he would also need to review what, if anything, had been captured on the internal security system during the relevant time period. He thanked Margaret for coming to him. He told her she had done the right thing. And then he said something that stayed with her for a long time afterward. He said that James Whitmore's job had been to protect the people in that room. He said that protecting someone did not always mean protecting them from violence. Sometimes it meant protecting them from the smaller things, from embarrassment, from distress, from the accumulated weight of moments that nobody was supposed to see but everybody remembered. He said that James had understood that, and that it mattered. Back in the staff quarters that evening, James Whitmore himself was unaware that any of this was in motion. He had filed his standard shift report brief factual, written in the clipped professional language that all guards used, and had made no specific mention of the incident at the writing desk. This was not an attempt to hide what had happened. It was simply that, in his own assessment of the afternoon, he had not done anything that required documentation. He had stepped forward. The situation had resolved. He had stepped back. That was all. He was young enough, still, to believe that that was how things worked. Meanwhile, in a different part of the castle entirely, Princess Charlotte was sitting at a window seat in her private apartment, doing homework. Her personal protection officer stood near the door. Her governess sat at a desk across the room. The drawing she had made that afternoon, the one that had been taken from under her hand and then returned, was folded neatly into the back, the cover of one of her notebooks. She had not shown it to anyone. She had not talked about what had happened at the desk. When her mother had asked her during a brief phone call that evening whether the afternoon had been difficult, Charlotte had said that it had been fine. Long, but fine. Princess Charlotte had learned very early in her life that certain things were better kept inside. She had learned that dignity was often a private business, practiced quietly in rooms where no one could see. She had learned that the world was watching her constantly, and that the best response to people who tried to DMI. 3 days after the lunch, James Whitmore was called into David Carroll's office and told to sit down. Carroll closed the door. He set a folder on the desk between them, but did not open it. He looked at James for a moment in the way that senior men sometimes look at younger ones, when they are trying to decide how much truth is useful, and then he told him everything that had been set in motion since the afternoon at Windsor. James listened carefully. He kept his face composed, which was not difficult. Composure was, by now, one of his most refined professional skills. But internally, something tightened in his chest. Not fear exactly. Something more like the feeling of standing on a surface that seemed solid, and then hearing a sound underneath it that made you wonder. Carroll explained that Margaret Howell's account had been reviewed alongside the internal security footage from the dining hall. The footage confirmed the sequence of events as Margaret had described them. It showed Tom Parker Bowles approaching the writing desk, crouching beside it, then reaching across to take the drawing from Charlotte's hand. It showed James stepping forward from his position by the door. It showed Tom returning the drawing and walking away. The footage had no sound. The visual sequence was clear enough to tell the story without it. Carroll then said that a quiet conversation had taken place. He did not name who had been involved, and James did not ask, in which the footage in Margaret's account had been reviewed by people at a senior level within the household. The conclusion of that conversation was that James had acted correctly, and that no formal action against him was being considered. On the contrary, his judgment in the moment had been noted positively by the people who were doing the reviewing. James exhaled slowly. "And Tom Parker Bowles?" he asked. Carroll paused. He chose his next words with the care of someone who had spent years in a role where the wrong phrase could cause genuine damage. He said that the matter had been handled. He said that Tom had been made aware, through appropriate channels, that his behavior during the lunch had not gone unobserved, and that the expectations for conduct inside royal spaces applied equally to all guests, regardless of family connection. He said that Tom had responded to this communication with what Carroll described, neutrally, as acknowledgement. What that acknowledgement looked like in practice, whether Tom had been apologetic or dismissive or somewhere in between, Carroll did not say. James understood, without being told that this was the part of the story he was not going to get access to. The inner workings of how the extended royal family handled its private difficulties were not available to royal guards. No matter how correctly they had behaved, what James did not know what he would only learn much later. Through the careful and sideways manner in which information moved through royal households was that the matter had also been raised. Briefly and delicately with the Princess of Wales, not because anyone had decided to alarm her, and not because Charlotte had said anything herself, but because there were people within the household whose job it was to ensure that the parents of royal children were nevertheless to know about anything that touched their children's dignity. The Princess of Wales had been told. She had listened without visible emotion, in the way she had perfected over years of receiving difficult information in professional settings. She had asked 2 questions: whether Charlotte had seemed distressed afterward, and whether the guard who intervened had been properly acknowledged. She was told no to the first, and that steps were being taken on the second. She had nodded and thanked the person who told her. And that had been the end of the conversation on her end, but privately. In the days that followed, she had watched Charlotte more carefully. Not in an anxious or obvious way. The Princess of Wales was far too skilled for that. She watched the way a mother watches a child she loves. The way you watch something precious that has been near the edge of something without quite falling. Checking for cracks that might not show on the surface, Charlotte gave her no reason to worry. She was bright and settled, full of opinions about her schoolwork and requests about an upcoming writing lesson. She mentioned nothing about the lunch. She did not seem weighed down by anything. The Princess of Wales found the folded drawing eventually, tucked into the back of a notebook that Charlotte had left on the kitchen table. She looked at it for a long moment. It was a drawing of the castle garden done in careful detail. The bare November trees rendered in gray pencil, with real precision for a 9-year-old, and then she placed it back exactly where she had found it. She never mentioned to Charlotte that she had seen it. Some distances between a parent and a child are not failures of love. They are acts of it. The Princess of Wales understood that her daughter had filed that afternoon somewhere internal, somewhere private, and that pulling it back out into the open would serve no one. Charlotte had handled it. Charlotte had, in fact, handled it better than most adults would have. There was nothing left to fix in his office. David Carroll closed the folder on his desk and told James that he could return to his duties. James stood, straightened his jacket, and thanked him. He was almost at the door when Carroll spoke again. "You made a good call," Carroll said quietly. "In a room full of people who were deciding whether to look away, you didn't." James nodded once. He walked back to his post. Outside the window, the November gardens were still bare and gray. But there was something in the air that felt almost imperceptibly like the ground preparing itself for what would come after winter. Weeks passed. The November cold settled into December, and Windsor Castle shifted into its winter rhythm, the preparations for Christmas, the arrival of decorations, the quiet expansion of staff schedules to accommodate the additional workload that the festive season always brought. The incident at the lunch faded into the background, as incidents at Windsor always eventually did, absorbed into the long and layered history of a place that had been holding secrets for centuries. But some things, once they happen, change the texture of a room even after they are over. James Whitmore noticed it first in the small ways. There was a particular quality of attention that senior staff began paying him, not dramatically, not in ways that announced themselves, but in the way that a door might be held open a half-second longer than necessary, or the way Carroll nodded at him in the corridor with a weight that felt different from before. He had not been promoted. He had not received a formal commendation. Nothing had been written down or made official, but within the invisible structure of the household, something had shifted. He had been measured and found steady, and in a place where steadiness was the highest currency, that counted for more than any certificate. Tom Parker. Bowles attended to further gatherings at Windsor over the following months. Both times he was present and civil and gave no one any reason to watch him carefully. The easy charm was still there, the wide laugh, the way he filled a room with his voice when he chose to, but he was more careful. Those who had been present at the November lunch and who saw him at these later gatherings all noticed, independently, that he moved differently around the younger members of the family. He kept his distance. He addressed them politely, briefly, and moved on. Whether this new carefulness was the result of genuine reflection or simply the practical calculation of a man who understood that he had been observed and noted, nobody could say for certain. People's interior lives, even in the most scrutinized family in the world, remained their own. Charlotte turned 10 in May. Her birthday was a private affair, a gathering at Kensington Palace. Family and close friends, children running through rooms in ways that children are only allowed to run in their own homes. She was photographed in the garden, laughing at something just outside the frame of the camera. Her hair loose and her posture entirely free of the careful architecture it assumed in public settings. The photograph was released by the palace and published everywhere. Every person who saw it said the same thing. She looked happy. She looked like herself. She looked like a child who was, despite everything, allowed to be exactly that, the drawing she had made that November afternoon, the castle garden. The bare trees, the pencil lines precise and careful, was eventually placed in a small wooden frame. Charlotte did this herself, without telling anyone. She put it on a shelf in her room between two books she was reading, and there it stayed. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not a statement about anything. It was simply a child keeping something she had made, in a place where she could see it, what the whole incident illuminated. For those who thought about it carefully, was something that went beyond the specific details of one afternoon in one room. It illuminated the invisible systems that exist inside institutions like the royal household. Systems built not from written rules but from accumulated judgment. From generations of people learning, often the hard way, what it means to be responsible for those who cannot always be responsible for themselves. Charlotte was 9 years old. She was also a princess, surrounded at all times by layers of protection. But the protection that mattered most that afternoon had not come from a protocol or a written procedure. It had come from one man's willingness to step forward in a moment when stepping forward cost him nothing but the comfort of staying still. That is, in the end, all that courage usually is. It is not the grand gesture or the heroic sacrifice. It is the small, deliberate choice to move when everything around you is choosing not to. James Whitmore had made that choice in 6 steps across a dining room floor, and he had made it correctly, and it had mattered. Not in a way that would ever make the news. Not in a way that would be recounted in biographies or commemorated in any official record. But it had mattered to the people who were in that room. It had mattered to Margaret Howell, who had watched and decided to speak. It had mattered to David Carroll, who had handled the aftermath with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood what was actually at stake. It had mattered, almost certainly, to the Princess of Wales, who had found a drawing in a notebook and placed it carefully back, and it had mattered. Perhaps most of all, to Charlotte herself, though she would never say so, because she had already learned at 9 years old that the things that matter most are often the ones you carry quietly. The castle stood, as it always had, enormous and gray against the winter sky. Its rooms filled and emptied with people who came carrying their own histories and their own difficulties, and it held all of them inside its old stone walls without comment. It had seen worse things than this. It had seen far, far worse things, but it had also seen this, a child at a desk, a pencil in her hand, drawing the world as she saw it. A man who reached too far, a guard who stepped forward, a story that would never make the papers, and therefore would never be forgotten by those who knew it. Some rooms keep their secrets perfectly. Windsor is one of them, but the people inside those rooms carry the truth with them wherever they go. Quietly, the way Charlotte carried the drawing, not as a wound, not as a weapon, but simply as proof that something happened, that it was seen and that it mattered enough to keep.